Today I'd like to speak about the difference between Gregg Shorthand used as a personal note-taking system and the business use of Gregg Shorthand for dictation or other business purposes. I've recently had some insights into this. My first series of 5 lectures on the use of Gregg Shorthand for personal note-taking was very well received, and I've had correspondence with a number of people over the internet, which has given me additional insights into the personal use of Gregg Shorthand, and that's what I'd like to share with you today. So the original series that I did emphasized the basics of spelling in Gregg Shorthand, and it talked about the highly focused use of abbreviations just for the abbreviations that the student was actually using quite a bit. So no extra trouble to learn abbreviations that weren't in actual use. And it focused on the use of the shorthand in daily life for things like note-taking or making grocery lists, etc. So since then, I've seen that the approach that I used was actually pioneered by Dr. Gregg, and it was fairly highly developed by him, although this is not well known. So again, these insights come from some materials that were shared with me by internet correspondence. And I'm going to pull up a timeline now and show you the parallel course that Gregg Shorthand took in 2 different directions. Don't video that, please. Okay, so this is a Gregg Shorthand timeline starting from the 1888 original version of Gregg, and the black text on the top shows the well-known editions of Gregg Shorthand. Starting from the 1888 original, there were about 5 intermediate editions before the well-known 1916 pre-anniversary edition, and there was a lot of development of abbreviations and special rules to have things done more quickly here. This black timeline, these are the ones that actually caught on very well and made Gregg very famous, and they're focused on the office use of Gregg Shorthand and using Gregg Shorthand for dictation, being able to write as quickly as people speak. So there was a big development in speeding things up between 1888 and 1916. It continued on. In 1929, the anniversary edition came out, which simplified some of the pre-anniversary materials, but again, still highly focused on office dictation. Then in 1948, Dr. Gregg died. In 1949, the simplified version came out, which simplified the anniversary version. These pre-anniversary and the anniversary versions were the fastest versions, and they had a lot of abbreviations that were aimed at business use. Simplified, although still aimed at business use, got rid of many of the abbreviations, went to spelling out more words, and so the top speed slowed down. We saw further simplifications in 1963 and 1978, and 2 other versions focused towards business use, again limiting the number of abbreviations. Series 90 had probably the fewest abbreviations of any of these except for the original, and that's when shorthand was pretty much dying out. There was one more version, which was the Centennial, which went back to recapture some of the abbreviations from Diamond Jubilee and simplified. But at this point, shorthand for business use was pretty much dying out. So these black elements here are what Gregg based his publishing empire on. There were many copies of these, and they were published in well-bound typeset books, etc. There was something else going on, though, too, under the radar of most people. So in Dr. Gregg's 1888 original version, which started off both the black and the green timelines, that's the basis for my first 5 lecture series. And it was very simple, with just focus on spelling, how to spell words, and then some abbreviating principles so you could abbreviate words as needed. Now, in the early, or the late 1920s, there's some evidence that Dr. Gregg started working with what he called his Gregg hand. And then in 1935, there was an edition of Gregg hand published. This Gregg hand was a personal use shorthand, and it was devoted to that. If we can back up a little bit, I'm going to show now a facsimile version of Gregg Hand. So this is the 1935 edition of Gregg Hand that was published. A simple phonetic writing for everyday use by everyone. So this is not focused for the stenographer or office uses. Gregg Hand was not professionally typeset. It appears as if it was produced on a typewriter. You'll see the margins are not justified here. Note that at the time Gregg Hand was produced, the anniversary edition was already well into production. And I'll just show you the differences. This copy of the anniversary has been marked up a little bit. But you'll see that this is professionally typeset. The margins are justified. You'll notice that this is right justified. It's professionally typeset. And you'll see quite a difference between the 500 copies of Gregg Hand that were published. Okay, I'll put this aside for a moment. Okay, so the next thing on this green timeline appears with the 1960 publication of the Notehand series. And again, this is after Dr. Gregg has died now. And versions of Notehand were published in 1960 and 1968. These I'd referenced in my first video series. I was aware of them at that time. These were aimed at the high school or college student, and again, they were a personal use Notehand, building on the foundations of Gregg Hand. One of the very, very useful materials that an internet correspondent provided me was the teacher's edition, the teacher's guide for Gregg Notehand. And that references a 25-year experimental period between basically the publication of Gregg Hand and the publication of Notehand. It doesn't reference Gregg Hand specifically, but it says there was a 25-year experimental period where they learned a lot of things. And I'm going to be going over what those things are because they're listed here in this teacher's guide. But it's on the distinctions between teaching shorthand for office use and learning shorthand for office use and what you want to do for personal use. So they actually figured out a lot of stuff that is not well documented, except for in this very rare teacher's guide for Gregg Notehand. So in the next segments, I'm going to be going over some of the elements in those teacher's guides and covering the implications for a student that wants to develop Gregg shorthand for personal use. Now I'm going to go over some of the elements that are here in the teacher's edition of the Gregg Notehand teacher's guide. And this is a very rare text, but I think there's some insight to be gained here. And the first thing I want to do is read a quote, and this quote is really what made the light bulb come on in my mind. And this is, I think, Mr. Leslie talking about the fundamental requirement for success of a system like this of personal note-taking. He says, the one fundamental necessity for success of a system of brief writing for personal use is that the user must find that it requires no more mental effort to read and write the system than to read and write longhand. Now here's where he gets into the difference between the office use. Any stenographer can write 3 to 5 times as fast in shorthand as he can in longhand. Why then does he not use his shorthand as a personal use writing instrument? Because it requires of him more mental effort than the writing or reading of longhand. He will write 120 words a minute from verbatim dictation in spite of the mental effort required, because that is how he earns his living. But when he sits down to write his diary or draft a letter, he writes longhand. It is slow, but less mental effort. So I think that is the key to the distinctions between business shorthand and personal shorthand. And now I'm going to start going through some of the differences, because all of the materials that are readily available to students, or virtually all of them, are focused on the business shorthand's objectives. And we are going to find that those are quite different from the objectives that we want for the personal use. So at this point, I'm going to bring up this little whiteboard and talk about the first of those elements, and that is dictation. So most of the materials that exist focus in on dictation and speed building in the shorthand use. And so this is hearing the material and reflexively writing it as soon as it's heard. It also involves creating a mental buffer in your head in case the words get ahead of your writing. You've retained some words in your head, and then you're just spewing them back out via your hand and that mental buffer. Now, that interferes with note-taking. If you're a college student trying to take notes, as opposed to verbatim recording a lecture, the process that's used in business dictation does not help, and in fact it interferes, because you do not concentrate on the meaning of the words. It's more of a reflexive reaction of producing the words that you heard through your ear on paper. And so the advice from Gregg Hand and from Notehand is avoid dictation practice when you're learning shorthand for personal use and note-taking. It interferes with comprehension. You'll be trying to comprehend what's being said and summarize it, which is quite different from accurately transcribing dictation. So again, the common texts are going to have practice in dictation. They're going to have practice in speed building. Those are not things that we want to use for personal shorthand. And here we want to even de-emphasize the speed. There will be other elements that we're going to emphasize, but those will be focused on our goals of comprehending and summarizing the material and then writing it down in an efficient manner. The next difference between business shorthand and personal use shorthand that I've drawn from the textual materials for teachers of Notehand is the use of longhand. In business shorthand use, the use of longhand is highly discouraged. It shouldn't be used. It decreases the speed. So the shorthand is emphasized in almost every occasion. For the personal use of shorthand, longhand can be very useful. First of all, if an outline in shorthand is not readily known, just go ahead and write it in longhand, and that gets you by what you need. You can go back if you wish and figure out a shorthand outline later. Another very important use is if the spelling needs to be preserved. And there's a couple of instances where this comes up. One is with names, where there may be several different ways of spelling the name Smith, and you want to capture the spelling, so you write it out in longhand. Or sometimes difficult words that you're not going to be able to remember the spelling for. Generally, this only needs to be done once, and so then after you do it the first time, then you can spell it out in shorthand, and since you already have on the same page probably the longhand spelling, you can cross-reference to that if you need to get the correct spelling. Another very useful use for longhand in the personal context is keywords and indexing. If you want a keyword, or this is related to the final bullet too, headings. If you want a keyword or heading to help you organize your notes, write it out in longhand, and it will stand out from the page of shorthand notes, and you can very quickly home in on the area of interest, and then from there read your shorthand about that. Okay, so those are the primary uses of longhand. So in the personal note-taking, you'll find it quite useful to go ahead and continue your use of longhand that you already know and just integrate it in with the shorthand to achieve your objectives. Now let's take a look at the differences between business and personal use of phrasing. In business applications, phrasing is highly used. There are many repetitive phrases, for instance, when a secretary takes a letter for dictation. So there's phrases that are going to come up over and over again. And some of those phrases can be quite complex. And so the secretary has a use for studying the phrasing in that nature. On a personal use, when you're taking notes, you're seldom using boilerplate phrases. If it was something like that, you would already know it and you wouldn't need to take notes about it. So what you're getting is unique combinations of words, and phrasing just doesn't come up as much in the personal note-taking context. There are a few repetitive phrases that will come up frequently just because of the construction of our English languages. Things like in the or on the, those are phrases that it would pay probably to learn for personal note taking. But those are just very simple combinations of commonly used words, and there's not that many of them. So in general, a study of phrasing is not going to have the payoff for personal note taking that it does for business. Now I'm going to go on from phrasing. I'll put this aside for a little bit and talk about the other thing which is very similar, and that is abbreviations. Some of the same things hold. The abbreviations in general are not going to be as useful for the personal note taker as they are for the business note taker. They will add substantial element of speed if you know a large number of abbreviations. They will also add some more ambiguity. Some of the abbreviations are the same for different words. So if you spell it out, some of that ambiguity is lessened. And that ambiguity makes it more difficult to decipher your notes. So more mental effort is required to decipher your notes, which is a drawback in the personal note taking. Again, there are more commonly used phrases and or words that would be abbreviated in a business type context. You'll encounter fewer such words in the personal context. And it does pay to use some abbreviations in personal context, but those are highly personal depending upon what you're writing. The key is, if you're writing it over and over and over, you may want to abbreviate it, and I've given you some tools, and Dr. Gregg has given you some tools in the previous lecture series to do that. But in general, for personal note taking, it's not going to pay off to study the high number of abbreviations that are studied in those series that we saw in the black elements of the timeline at the beginning of this lecture. For the final segment in this video, I'm going to give you some quotes of just miscellaneous points in this teacher's guide to Gregg Notehand, and then we'll close it out. So this is on speed, and again, here I'm just going to quote directly from the manual. As previously explained, the Notehand student should never be permitted to take verbatim notes from dictation. Few stenographers use shorthand for their personal use. Few shorthand students in college use their shorthand for personal use. The reason is that they have become accustomed to writing verbatim from dictation and find the adjustment to note making a difficult one. So we heard a similar quote to that earlier in the lecture series. I just wanted to emphasize that, and again he stated it in a different way, but these two skills of business dictation and shorthand for personal use are quite different, and in a sense they may be mutually exclusive. I know there are some people that have learned the business shorthand and gone on to use it for personal use, but they are more of the exception than the rule, at least according to some of the things that are detailed here in this teacher's guide. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is learning burden here, and basically the point is made that it's a burden to learn all of those abbreviations, but not just the spelling, and that it's not necessary for the note-taking student or the person that's using it for personal use. He says it's unnecessary for the writer to learn and use it as though it were a branch of mathematics. When this fact is understood, the burden is enormously reduced. And here again, the requirement for complete conformity, ... may easily double the amount of time required to reach a given level of skill. So again, he's saying an attempt to enforce such conformity will result in much discouragement and failure. And so he's very emphasizes that that shouldn't be done. Many of the other systems had obscure rules, like you make a circle clockwise in most cases, but if you make it counterclockwise, then it implies something else, maybe the absence of a missing letter. The point being made here is that those more complex elements are not required for the student for personal use. A student might pick it up, but you don't want to enforce that on the student just trying to pick this up for personal use, because it's much extra memory load that's not required for that the personal use objective. Okay, and here under a few words to the shorthand teacher. The Notehand outlines are in general more fully written than the shorthand outlines. So things are generally going to be spelled out more. There's not going to be the same degree of abbreviation as in the business use. And here, again, a quote to reinforce something we heard earlier. It's urgently recommended that from the beginning, the Notehand students be taught to give no weight what we used to call, quote, shorthand theory. And that's all these things about the circle has to go this way or that way, or has to be inside the angle or outside the angle. So the point is, don't burden the student with all of those things. Here's another quote, and this is a quote. It said, it's called Dr. Gregg's oft-repeated maxim: when in doubt, write it out. So the student knows how to spell, they know how to use the alphabet. If there's any question, well, they could either write it in longhand or they can just spell it out all the way phonetically. And that works just fine for the note-taking student. And here, the final quote I'm going to leave you with is, in any case, it is more important that the student write some readable outline without conscious thought of the outline and without hesitation than that he write the textbook outline as a result of stopping to think about the theory. Okay, so that's it for this, this video on the differences between business use of shorthand and personal use.